Hello again everyone and welcome back to The Underground. This is the Intel update for November 16th through the 22nd, 2025. Crazy week like usual, but this time it's going to be a little bit shorter because a lot of the things that have happened this week I've already covered in the wire reports throughout the week, so no need to rehash a lot of these things, but some things we can expand a little bit on and maybe get a little bit more clarity on what's going on with some of these events as we start getting into the holiday season. Getting right to it with the global strategic concerns this week, the main focus has been ICE operations, or rather the significant resistance to ICE operations around the country. This is, again, a trend that has been going on for several months now. However, things are starting to get a little bit more heated as ICE operations continue to spread around the United States. Also in the United States, all eyes are on the Somalian situation in Minneapolis this week, which have brought about a lot of details and situations and scandals that have been very much open secrets in the city for a very long time, but now many Americans are just now figuring out the scale at which a lot of the fraud is being committed in Minneapolis, so we'll get into that in a bit. Down south in the Caribbean, the situation really remains unchanged from last week. No big major updates there, and no real indication as to whether or not the U.S. is going to be conducting any kind of operation there or not. The White House seems to be kind of interested in doing some sort of diplomatic effort, but that could all be a smokescreen to move into the final stages of whatever military campaign they have planned there. Again, it's all speculation and not really that useful to keep harping on, so we'll just play it by ear and see how it works out down there. Similar situation over in Eastern Europe. The peace talks continue between Ukraine, the United States, and Russia. The United States and Russia have been working out the details of various types of peace agreements over the past few days and months, but the general public has only really been granted just a few snippets here and there, so there's really no conclusion that can be made either way, but the talks do continue, and we're in kind of one of these cycles again where both sides seem to be kind of interested in finding some sort of common ground, which is good. We have had this happen dozens of times before, so it doesn't really pay to get one's hopes up, because in 2 weeks from now both sides may have a spat again and then they veer away from any kind of peace talks, but for now the situation is positive once again, which is something that's probably a good thing. That's the situation globally. For strategic movement, again, nothing significant to report on this front. Everything is basically where it was before. The Gerald Ford is still in the Caribbean Sea and is in the theater of operations of Southcom, so all players are on deck for if the United States wanted to do something in Venezuela, but time will tell. Moving to Kinetic Events for the United States this week, it has been quite busy, unfortunately. I am once again in the perpetual battle of trying to keep my maps updated with all of the events that are a little bit more significant than the average street crime, but throughout the United States, violent crimes continue as before. A lot of the very brutal events this week have come from public transit, as one might expect. The two high-profile attacks that I've focused on this week are the immolation attack that occurred on the Blue Line train in Chicago, and also the subway stabbings, where random people have just been stabbed in the face in New York City on the subway system there. So in the United States, it's become quite clear over the past few years that from a risk management perspective, public transit are death traps. So not everybody can avoid public transit. Some people have to use it for their job or just to get around because they don't have a vehicle or something like that, but never relax. That's for sure. Especially as we start getting into the big travel seasons where people are going to be moving around a lot. There's a lot more incentive to commit random acts of violence and just general street crimes, muggings, and things like that. So something to be aware of as we move forward into the winter months. On the other side of the coin, this week a lot of the violence has largely centered around immigration issues, mostly when it comes to ICE raids in a particular area. Continuing the trend from last week, Charlotte has experienced, again, more unrest, mostly up and down Central Avenue, which is host to a lot of very open and very brazen immigration problems. The past few days, the Charlotte Observer and a lot of the Charlotte-based media have really just been focusing on publishing teary-eyed interviews of some illegal immigrant business owner who's so upset that they had to close down their business while ICE is in their area. Just kind of completely glossing over the fact that illegal immigrants are in fact criminals. It's just a fact of the matter, right? Everyone who is an illegal immigrant in this country made a conscious decision to break the law, so, that's kind of the way that it is, but we all know how it goes. Charlotte is a absolute dystopian hellhole, so you tend to get things like this. Very large community watch efforts, very big and very well-funded groups that are doing everything they can to openly say, we encourage people to commit felonies. We're literally an occupying force. One of the main agencies, the Siembra organization in North Carolina that has been kind of active for a lot of these immigration issues, they openly say on their website, like, we're trying to dominate, we're trying to take over, we're trying to eradicate everyone who is not us, right? That's exactly what they say on their own website. So, you gotta take these things at face value sometimes. If someone tells me that, I'm inclined to believe them. So that kind of unrest has been more or less a commonality there. It's not really been that effective. The resistance to ICE nationwide hasn't really stopped any ICE raids at all. I mean, that's just kind of the way that it is, but it's only a matter of time before ICE are going to have to start making decisions on where to go based on the resistance they're going to see, especially considering we now have more routine, everyday, garden variety terrorism plots that just kind of come and go, and nobody ever really does anything, such as the case in Virginia this week, in which case a pair of brothers, one of which is still currently employed as an assistant principal at a high school in Virginia. Both of them planned to travel to Las Vegas to conduct shootings against ICE. They're treating it like it's some sort of sporting event, right? They're trying to hunt ICE agents for sport. That's the kind of way these people think nowadays. As disturbing as that is, they just talk about it like they're discussing the weather, which is exactly how they got caught. So, like I wrote in The Wire, the way that these guys got rolled up was probably the dumbest possible way ever. The story that has been told by the authorities, at least, is that an off-duty cop was eating dinner next to these guys at the next table over from them at a restaurant in Virginia Beach, and he overheard them talking about their planned killing spree of ICE agents just kind of out in the open during dinner. And, one thing led to another, investigation continued on, and they kind of confessed to it, right? So, for those who think, well, that sounds a little sketchy, maybe the cop's lying, that's a very good possibility. I'm sure it'll come out in court. I'm sure that a very close examination of their digital devices will show that they had planned to commit these sorts of crimes, because at least one of them had already purchased a plane ticket. They both had purchased firearms and selected rounds that they thought were best for penetrating body armor. I mean, they're kind of stupid, but still quite serious. So there's all that. But this is one of those things to just kind of be aware of. And to be honest, none of this is really that surprising. I lived in Virginia Beach for about a year or so, several years ago. And I can tell you that if you were to sit down and, eat a meal at any restaurant in Virginia Beach, the chances of you hearing someone planning and plotting a violent crime, especially from a more liberal perspective, is extremely high. Okay, so it's not that hard to imagine. It's like going to an Antifa cafe, in Portland or Seattle, and overhearing somebody, wanting to take a shot at Charlie Kirk. You're going to go to these, strongholds of this kind of ideology, and, well, yeah, that's exactly what you're going to see. So, least surprising method of being caught ever, but it just kind of goes to show the grand scale at which this resistance to ICE efforts have kind of carried on. And like I mentioned, and I've mentioned this several times, ICE is not going after people just for being illegal. This is probably a PR thing, so that anytime some kind of, mainstream media source or some kind of politician starts screeching about, police brutality, you're being violent with this person, and they start yammering about that, the people running the ICE social media accounts can come back and say, oh, well, sorry to hear that, but here's the guy we were arresting, and here's what he's charged with. And it's always something so horrific that you can't even say it in polite company. That's the kind of thing they're going after. So, something to keep in mind. People are going to be insane. It's just one of those things. But as we get into more of the holiday season, you're going to start to see probably more of this, because, well, more and more people are getting funding together. More and more agencies are starting to get better organized and things like that. So as time goes on, resistance will increase. It won't decrease. It will increase, and they'll get a lot better at trying to protect violent criminals in various cities around the U.S. So that's it for the nationwide kind of overview this week. Let's move down into the regions for a closer look at some issues this week. And technically, this first one is actually a nationwide issue still. There were a couple of Cloudflare outages this week. There was a major outage on November 18th. And a smaller outage, again, on November 20th that I'm not sure how many people it affected. But the November 18th outage was the largest one. And I have seen some very speculative and unconfirmed numbers that it took down 20 to 25% of the entire internet. And the reason that it happened was very interesting. Cloudflare initially stated that they thought that it was a cyber attack, and it still may be. It's one of those things that you're probably never going to get the truth on, but they initially thought it was a cyber attack, but then they revealed that it was actually a single file that, quote, suddenly doubled in size. Now, how that exactly happened, it's not clear at the moment. I'm sure we'll find out something later on, but that's the story they're going with. One single file was changed, and it took down 20% of the internet. So for the non-tech nerds out there, yes, indeed, our public internet infrastructure is being held together by some duct tape and string. And yes, changing a single file will, in fact, break a good chunk of the internet. So Once again, this may end up being the result of malign action. It could be the result of incompetence. My guess is you're probably not going to find out either way. If it was malign action, you're probably not going to find out. They're not going to tell you the truth because, well, they don't want to look bad. They don't want to give the hackers or the malign actors any kind of credence, right? So they're just going to kind of conceal that a little bit. But also if it was incompetence, right, from their data centers in Mumbai or something, they're not going to want to talk about that for various reasons. But nobody wants to look bad. Nobody wants to talk about how vulnerable their systems are. Even though Cloudflare is a major company, they're still not going to want to be honest with their stakeholders. So something to be aware of. Look, the internet is breaking on a weekly basis at this point. So having alternative communications plans is becoming a little bit more important with each passing day. But that's it for the tech stuff this week. Moving to North Carolina for a moment. Like I said, the resistance to ICE operations in Charlotte is pretty high. But the ICE operation in Charlotte is actually not that large. They've only arrested a couple hundred people, which is just peanuts compared to the number of people they could be arresting, right? Mecklenburg PD is, of course, not doing anything. They've been given the order to stand down, so ICE agents they don't have local police protection because the cops want harm to come to them in their city. So same story as always, same story all the places where these ICE agents are going. That's just the way that it is. So risks are pretty high, and one of the more dangerous things with these ICE raids to consider for the average person, right? Even if you're not really concerned about some of the more high-level nationwide issues, these ICE raids are doing a couple of things, and in Charlotte they've done one thing in particular, which is to show the actual organic population of Charlotte just how many people are in their city that are not from here, they're not citizens, and they have created a lot of infrastructure. Central Avenue is kind of the main drag in Charlotte, or at least a good part of it, and there's a lot of restaurants, there are a lot of businesses, there are a lot of entities, and it turns out all of them have kind of shut down due to immigrants being there, right? People are now doing exactly the same thing that is in every other city. They find that ICE is in town, guess what? Traffic goes down. Suddenly you don't have gridlock. You don't have rush hour. You try to go shopping, suddenly the grocery stores are empty. And it's like, you try to think, there's no way there are this many people here. But the daily life for people has proven this, people just living their daily life, they suddenly realize, wait a minute, this is how many people were illegal in my area? So, yeah, Charlotte has kind of proven that. Same thing with all the other states, because Charlotte is not one of those cities that you tend to think of when you think of a huge illegal immigrant presence, but it's true. I mean, it really is. Every major city in the U.S. is like that. It doesn't matter how big or how small. There are a lot of illegal immigrants in the United States. Turns out that it's probably a lot more than what people think. So, that's something to keep in mind. Also in North Carolina last night, I wanted to mention it today because it just happened. There was a mass shooting at the Christmas tree lighting ceremony in Concord, which ironically is just outside Charlotte. It's like a little suburb of Charlotte. Right up front, this appears to be kind of a gang thing because they released the names of at least two of the suspects. The first suspect goes by the name Nasir Ahmad Bostic, and the second suspect is Kivivan Rashad Bostic, so they sound like they're relatives, same surname, right? The third suspect was unnamed, but the local PD basically says this was a case of mutual combat. Two groups started shooting at each other, so maybe a gang thing, maybe a tribal thing, hard to say. Concord is kind of a small town on the edge of a big town, so it tends to be more of a sort of quaint, high-income area, but these kinds of violent attacks are starting to occur and injure bystanders, even in some of the more affluent areas around the country. So not a new thing by any means, but it's going to continue as we start getting into the crowded season. But that's it for North Carolina. Let's move over to the meat of the matter this week, which is the Midwest, the great state of Minnesota, and the happenings in Minneapolis. So for those who live in Minneapolis, quite literally, this is the least surprising bit of news they have seen all year, but the Somalis, turns out, are a little bit of a problem in Minneapolis. And this week there have been 2 levels of widespread and institutional corruption involving potentially billions of U.S. tax dollars, all centered around the Somalian community in Minneapolis. So the first scandal was the Feeding Our Future scandal, which occurred some time ago, but now more and more people are being indicted. This was widespread fraud from all levels, involving a sort of soup kitchen, food bank, food pantry kind of arrangement. But it turns out it was all just fraud. So we'll get into exactly the meat of the matter, how it worked out. But this is the earlier scandal. So just for clarification, the Feeding Our Future scandal that is occurring in Minneapolis right now is older. It occurred some time ago. It's just more and more people, because there's more spotlight on it now, more and more people are being indicted. I think they're up to 76 people indicted right now so far for this hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fraud in Minneapolis. But it occurred some time ago. So that is the stage being set for the next scandal, which has come to light over the past few weeks, really, which is the Autism Services Department. So I put together this graphic to help us kind of understand exactly how this scam works, because it's not particularly brilliant. It's a pretty low IQ effort, to be honest, but it makes up for that in its brazenness and the fact that it worked for such a long period of time and continues to work to this day. So this particular scandal, the one that we're focused on right now, the Autism Services Department scandal, involves Somalians having children and then, of course, registering them, with social security numbers. And one of the things that they also do in terms of just like a matter of recourse for just having a kid, is to get them diagnosed with autism. So they will go to specific Somalian doctors, which are known throughout the Somali community for just pencil whipping autism diagnoses. You walk in, get the paperwork, walk out. That's the way that this diagnosis system works. Once that kid gets diagnosed with autism, the parents can then enroll that kid in various social programs. They can sign up for a whole plethora of welfare products and things like that due to their kid having autism, right? So we're talking things like medical care, daycare, special education programs, all this kind of thing, right? In some cases, cash payments. In some cases, extra financial resources. There's a lot, right? There's a reason why it's so hard to understand the welfare state in the United States, because it's intentionally complicated. It's not just one program. It's not just one check. In many cities, specifically at the city level, there are a lot of programs where you just walk up and get something, right? And it's hard to say exactly how much is being used. So they take advantage of that. Turns out a lot of these clinics, a lot of these daycares, a lot of these special education programs, a lot of these social programs that are designed for children with autism didn't actually exist, right? They were fraudulently saying that these kids were enrolled. The kids either did not exist or the program did not exist. And you might be thinking, well, how in the Sam Hill can they get away with this fraud for so long? Because surely there are auditing programs at each level, right? And you're absolutely correct. There are audits of government programs, especially when it comes to things like, welfare stuff. However, it turns out that a lot of the people conducting the welfare audits were Somalian, okay, and in on it, right? So that's kind of how it works. You find out that, okay, this learning academy, ABC or whatever, is located on the corner of this street and that street. And then, the auditor drives by and finds out that's actually a liquor store. There's nothing here. There's no daycare here. There's no clinic here. But on paper, it's there. And in the Senate and in the House in Minnesota, they're allocating funding for it. And the place doesn't actually exist. Or it's an empty lot. There's a mailing address, but it doesn't go to anywhere. That's the level of fraud that was happening. It started as more lower level stuff, like people getting fake diagnoses for their kids and then enrolling them in programs they didn't need, and then that money was getting kicked back to various levels of the community, right? But now it's expanded to just be straight up blanket fraud, right? It's sort of like the PPP scandal from the COVID era, if you want to think of it in those terms. And kind of like how you can go to that website and search for the names of the businesses that got small business loans, and the business name, the no kidding business name, is something like Give Me a Hellcat LLC or something like that. And it's oh my gosh, this fraud is just so blatant and so open. So that's kind of the general overview of how this works. It's just straight up fraud, and it's really, really bad fraud too. It's just not very well concealed at all, because it doesn't need to be, because everyone involved, from the community leaders to the politicians to even the governor, right? Nobody can touch this issue, because if they point out Somali crime, they lose the Somali vote. And if they lose the Somali vote, they lose the state's vote. That's just the way that it is. One of the reasons why immigration is such a bigger concern on an economic front is due to two words: remittance payments. So one of the things that happens is everybody along this process gets a cut. The doctor gets a cut. The parents get a cut. All these social workers get a cut. The social programs get a cut from all this money that just appears in bank accounts, right? They're linking their actual personal bank accounts to federal and state aid, right? So it's not like they're trying to hide, right? But one of the things they do is they immediately send that money back home to Somalia. And here is where the nationwide importance comes in. It's a lot. The numbers are saying that it's possibly $1.7 billion. Somalia is technically a failed state, so they're not a nation state, but you can think about it like this. The Somalian population in one American city, Minneapolis, is sending more money back to that country than is earned in that country alone. So that's kind of a big deal, right? And one of the reasons that people have kind of focused on this is because of what's going on in Somalia. Somalia, again, is not a nation state. They are a failed state. And it turns out warlords kind of run the country. So how are they getting this money back to Somalia? Because it's not like you can just deposit money into a bank account and it just appear there. I mean, I guess that you could do that, but what are they doing mostly? Hawala. They're doing the Hawala network. I have a whole video on the Hawala network system if you want to check that out from a while ago, but the short version is that it's a complicated way of sending money from one place to another without governments knowing and without taxes being taken out. The exception, of course, is that there are Hawala brokerage fees. So think of it like Western Union, but for the Muslim population of the world. It's not exclusively an Islamic thing, but it did kind of gain a lot of popularity there, which is why you mostly see it in Muslim countries. So interesting way of sending money. It's not bad in and of itself, except for when it's used for criminal endeavors, right? And one of the criminal endeavors is the fact that a lot of the Hawala brokers, as in almost all of the Hawala brokers in Somalia, are actually members of Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab is a very infamous terror group throughout Somalia and Northern Africa at large. They're very famous for being extremely brutal and very warlord-like. They have their origins in Al-Qaeda, as with most insurgent groups throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa. However, they're more akin to ISIS. A lot of the times you'll see them using ISIS flags. They're also kind of similar to AQAP or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It's one of those things. They're kind of their own thing. So to say that they're like another terror group is probably disingenuous because they're really their own sort of thing. But yeah, they do have their origins in a few different contradictory groups, right? Like ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't really work that well together, but this group kind of has their foot in either one of those groups. But anyway, I digress. The United States, specifically the taxpayers of Minneapolis, the taxpayers of Minnesota, paying these guys the bulk of their salary because they're allowing the Somalians in Minneapolis to send money back to Somalia through Hawala brokers, which end up in the hands of Al-Shabaab. Well, that's just not a great look now, is it? Remember, TIA, this is Africa, right? So they don't need a whole lot to be very effective, right? So to us, $1.7 billion, I mean, that's still a lot of money in American terms, but $1.7 billion being sent back to Somalia, that is a substantial fighting force. In terms of insurgent groups, you can do a lot with $1.7 billion in Somalia. You can definitely do a lot with that. So, of course, how much of that money is going straight to Al-Shabaab, how much of a fee they're taking, is going to vary. You literally can never know. It's all done via handshake and cash. All $1.7 billion is probably not going into the hands of Al-Shabaab. It's probably buying a whole lot of flat-screen TVs in Mogadishu, but in terms of how many AK-47s and mortar rounds it's buying, I don't know. Either way, it's not a good look, and this is why President Trump, as of this morning, before I started recording this, I saw that the White House has ended the temporary protected status, TPS status, for the Somalis in Minneapolis is now terminated. So that's a very, very strong development. It probably hints to the growing concerns that have been, slowly mounting over time, but yeah. We'll see how it all works out, but a very fascinating look at how some of this fraud is occurring on a gargantuan scale. And rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, Minneapolis is not the only place this is occurring. I would bet my last dollar that the same exact thing is happening with other terror groups, with other communities that are popped up around the United States as well. So it'll be kind of fun to see how that works out over the next few days and weeks as people realize that, it's not just the Somalians doing this, it's other groups too. So we shall see. So that's all I've got for today. Let's roll it up with the Intercepted GhostNet Reports. It has been a busy week for the GhostNet. I've got a lot of people talking, a lot of traffic back and forth, a lot of very interesting exchanges of information. It's doing very good. We're doing good this time of year. It's nice and pleasant. It's not hot and sticky anymore, so a lot of people try to get out and take advantage of the weird solar weather to see how far they can get. One thing to remember, though, is that the Thursday night RadioNet is not the only one. There are other times during the week that you can have the best possible chance of success for long haul shots. So like for the United States to Europe, or for Europe to Australia, or so on and so forth, right? Thursday nights are generally for more America, North America, Canada kind of news sort of thing, whereas Saturdays are for more of the long haul thing, because you have to, for many of us who don't have these big gigantic, permanently set up arrays, you've got to change your antenna around. If you want to talk locally, you've got to have your antenna arranged one way, whereas if you want to try to get a long haul shot, you may have to change your antenna around, but that's the reason for that. So radio stuff, complicated, I know. It'll get easier with time, but just wanted to remind everybody that, yeah, there are multiple times throughout the week that you can meet up. It's not just Thursday nights, even though the Thursday night one is definitely where most people tend to show up. So dozens of people tune in every week. It's always good to see that, especially with all the Cloudflare outages, right? It makes it easier for us to have a little bit more off-grid and resilient way of communicating, just in case the worst should happen and we lose all comms, right? So that's what this is all about. And with that, that's all I have for today. Here are the sources as usual, and of course you guys can get the main sources from the horse's mouth from the Obsidian page, where each source is listed by day. That is the link that I put at the end of every wire report wherever I cut and paste. I cut and paste these wire reports to like a dozen different places. But every place should have one link, the one link that you can click to go and find all of the research that I have on anything I've done. So all the sources are there for those of you who want to double check, cross check, triple check anything that I say and do. So thank you guys again for all of your support. I could not do it without you. We are certainly in the middle of another social media purge. So analytically, the past couple of weeks, things have not done super well. So again, I don't tend to focus on things like that. Analytics, I don't really care about, to be honest. But I have noticed that a lot of the stuff that I push out doesn't really make it to that many people. So Patreon is fine. You'll see pretty much everything that I have to say there. But for things like social media, just be advised, you might not see some things that I'm posting, especially when it comes to like time-sensitive emergencies. That kind of thing tends to not get super wide traction. So just something to keep in mind. Everything's manipulated these days, but I do really appreciate those of you who stick around and support me either way. So that's all I've got. I'll stop talking now, but don't forget, we've got one more week until Thanksgiving, so don't forget to take your turkeys out of the freezer, and we'll see you next week. So thanks again, and as always, fight in the shade.